morning. On behalf of the German Marshall Fund and our co-host, the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the Central Asia Caucasus Institute, I want to welcome all of you to today's discussion on the new Eurasia energy landscape. Thank you for being here early on a Monday morning. I hope everybody had a great weekend. I'd also like to thank all of our panelists, including officials from the US government, Europe, private sector representative, think tank partners, energy sector experts, for participating in what I hope is a conversation today about a timely and important topic. My name is Jonathan Katz. I'm a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund here in Washington, D.C. I previously served before coming over to GMF at the U.S. Agency for International Development as the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Europe and Eurasia, and worked closely on the topic of energy projects across Europe and Eurasia, and had an opportunity to work closely with many of the panelists here today, and some of those who've come and are sitting in the audience as well. I also work closely with State Department, National Security Council, Department of Energy, and so I'm very excited to see Jonathan Elkind here today to participate in this effort. And I've also had the opportunity to work with the EU and also many partners in the Black Sea region. We have the Georgian ambassador here, so thank you for coming and participating as well. For over 40 years, GMF has been a leading voice on both sides of the Atlantic to strengthen transatlantic relations, democracy, economic prosperity, and energy diversity, security, and independence. GMF's offices and programs, including in Brussels, Eastern Europe, and the Black Sea region, Ankara, Bucharest, Warsaw, and elsewhere across Europe, are on the ground leading the debate on the economic security and geopolitical importance of increased transatlantic energy sector cooperation and energy independence. Today's event and the focus on the new Eurasia energy landscape is timely. In a time of great uncertainty and increased political and economic pressure in Europe, especially from Russia, our mutual security interests, prosperity, and future is tied to deepening energy sector and technical cooperation, including efforts to create more integrated markets, diversification, energy efficiency, and independence. All these issues are critical for the US, Europe, and especially for those partners in the Black Sea region like Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova that seek greater EuroAtlantic integration and energy resiliency and are especially vulnerable to Russian energy manipulation and hybrid warfare. Today's conference is a rare opportunity to connect pipeline geopolitics that surround issues including Nord Stream 2 and US LNG exports to Europe to ongoing energy sector reform supported by the US, EU, and IFIs across Eastern Europe, including the implementation of the third energy package and energy assistance projects. The conference today is an opportunity to assess and better understand challenges and provide short, medium, and long-term policy recommendations to strengthen energy security and prosperity across Europe and bolster US-European energy sector cooperation and trade. This effort needs to include all of the key stakeholders at the table. We also hope today's event will be a platform for innovative and forward thinking that will enable us to tackle and stay ahead of emerging trends. For example, digital disruptions and cyber attacks. Again, I want to thank all of you for being here this morning. I want to invite Maya up to say a few words as well, and Mamuka as well, to say a few words of introduction.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning. Welcome to GMF. I'm here on behalf of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. My name is Maya Tarashvili, and I am a research fellow and program manager at FPRI's Eurasia program. FPRI, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a Philadelphia-based think tank, foreign policy think tank, that is based on a premise that a nation must think before it acts. So we aim to educate the public and the policymakers, and we do so with our robust programming, including the Eurasia program. The Eurasia program has over 24 Eurasia experts who are based all over the country, but also all over the region itself, the Eurasia region itself. The program includes things like the Black Sea Initiative and the Baltic Initiative, and we're able to narrow in on some of the issues that we find to be very important for U.S. foreign policy and strategic interests. That includes things like looking at Moldova a little bit more closely, looking at the Caucasus region a bit more closely. So that's why we were able to launch Moldova Monthly, the Caucasus Cables, the Baltic Bulletin, but also very importantly, the Black Sea Strategy Papers, which are all overseen by our research director, Chris Miller, who is here today. So I would like to welcome all of you to check out FPRI.org and see the work of our organization, who is dedicated to offering ideas and fresh insights to the American public and policymakers. We're very pleased to be a part of this conference today, and we are very grateful to our co-sponsors, GMF, Mamuka, and also the Central Asia Caucasus Institute, Mamuka Tsereteli. So let's welcome Mamuka so he can say hello to us as well.
I would like to join my colleagues from German Marshall Fund and Foreign Policy Research Institute and welcome you all for this conference today. Central Asia Caucasus Institute, which is part of the American Foreign Policy Council, is a leading institution that tries to advance knowledge about vast region stretched from Eastern Europe to Central Asia and beyond. And we try to advance ideas, connectivity between countries, and people-to-people connection. And most importantly, we try to bring knowledge about the region to Washington as well as elsewhere. We have biweekly publications, Central Asia Caucasus Analyst. We have Turkey Analyst, some other major publications called Silk Road paper series. And we hope that this conference will contribute to better understanding of emerging new dynamics in energy landscape of Eurasia, where countries of Central Asia and Caspian region have major role to play going forward. So I'm looking forward to our discussions today. Thank you.
So as you can see, I think we have a really exciting program today, and the bringing together of the three different organizations to focus on this region, I think highlights the importance of what we're hoping to get out of this conversation today, and hopefully take with us and also to policymakers ideas how to move forward on these key issues. So I think what we're going to do right now is we're going to move into the first panel number one. So if I could ask our panelists, our colleagues, and some of them are my former colleagues, to please come up and join us up here. And I think Yanis will need you as well. And so I just want to make a reminder to you that this is all on the record as well. And so I hope that allows us to have as free-flowing a discussion as possible. And we look forward in this panel to all of your questions and answers, and the answers from our panelists. Thank you. Great. Thank you. I want to welcome everyone, our panelists today. Thank you so much. Some of you have traveled afar from Vienna to be here today. And I think as it was advertised, this panel is going to focus on the U.S., the EU, and energy sector reforms in the Black Sea region. But of course, I think when you look at the history of the work of our panelists, and we were talking earlier, I think the combined energy experience in this sector is 3/4 of a century. Obviously, your experiences are particularly important. So we have an incredibly distinguished panel that includes Yanis Kopač, who heads the Energy Community Secretariat based in Vienna. We have USAID's Director for Energy and Infrastructure in the Europe and Eurasia Bureau, Steve Burns, and Will Poland, who's the Senior Director at the U.S. Energy Association. While at USAID, as I mentioned earlier, I had an opportunity to work with all of our three panelists, and I really deeply appreciate your willingness to come here and to participate. And really kind of excited because I think this is a real opportunity to talk about assistance and technical assistance and development and reforms in the energy sector, which I think really is something that we in Washington need to do a better job of elevating because it's been critical. Reforms in this sector have been critical for the last 2.5 decades in terms of U.S. policy, not only just in this region, the Black Sea region, but in Central Europe and across Europe. And I want to talk a little bit about that today. And that's what sort of drove me to this, thinking about this panel when we talked about with our partners about hosting an energy conference. And I look back at just at USAID alone, in 25 years, what had been accomplished and achieved in transitioning countries across Central and Eastern Europe, and the economic impact, transitioning these countries to market economies, but also the struggle today with countries in the region like Ukraine, countries that have advanced considerably over the last decade, like Georgia, or those countries that are in peculiar and maybe more difficult geostrategic spots like Armenia and the Balkans as well. So it's not a conference necessarily in the Balkans, but I know, Janusz, your work and also Steve, Will, and others has spanned across this entire region. So I hope that you can pull out some of your nuggets of wisdom and thoughts on how we can continue to move this forward, but also to elevate assistance, because it's right now we're in the middle of a continuous debate about foreign assistance and assistance in the region, and whether or not it's in our U.S. interests or the interests even of European colleagues, because they have the same exact debate that we have today here, and how we make sure that we channel it to achieve the goals that countries like the U.S. or the EU are set out to achieve. How do we achieve those goals, and how do we work better with our partners in the region? So I'm really thrilled that you're here today. I know I have to do a more formal introduction of each one of you, which I'm going to do, and I hope you can. Before we started, I've asked each one of you to speak directly to your priorities, the challenges you see in the region. Will, based on your experience too, you've seen this transition, and you've also seen backsliding as well. To talk about those issues, to also talk about trends, emerging trends that we see in the region, issues from cyber aggression. And Russia is also obviously looms large in this conversation. So I'm very much interested to hear more about efforts to address Russian energy aggression, and not only from the perspective of pipeline interconnectors, but the nitty-gritty of addressing issues like corruption and democracy, and things that really matter in terms of the transition of economies and countries in this region. The same type of transition that occurred in the very countries, Janusz, where you came from and where you started in terms of your political career and the work that you were doing, and Will, that you were part of, and Steve, that you've been part of. So let me just read quickly the bios, and then we'll turn to opening statements. And then we're going to open it up to question and answer. Again, this is on the record, so I really welcome all of your participation. So as I mentioned earlier, our first panelist is Janusz Kopacz, Director of Energy Community Secretariat. He's been director since December 2012. Before taking up this post, he was Slovenia's Director General for Energy in the Ministry of Economy from 2008 to 2012, where he was responsible for the implementation of the third energy package, Energy Acquis. He served as the Ministry of Environment, Spatial Planning and Energy from 2000 to 2004, and Minister of Finance in 1992, in addition to a 10-year career as chairman of the Budget Committee in the Slovenian Parliament. So I've seen it both from the executive branch and the legislative branch as well. Our second panelist is Steve Burns, who's currently the director of the Energy and Infrastructure Office and the Europe and Eurasia Bureau at USAID. He has been with USAID in a senior leadership position focused on energy reforms, and independence for almost a decade. He's also has extensive private sector experience. I worked incredibly closely with Steve for 3.5 years. I can't think of anybody better who's more knowledgeable about the current challenges and reforms that are needed to be addressed in the region. But he also carries on, I think, really a deep legacy of USAID's role in this region, and I'm really thrilled that you could be here today. Our last panelist is the one I have the most written about, and is Will Poland, and he's the Senior Director for Europe and Eurasia at the U.S. Energy Association. I think there are a few people in Washington who have Will's history and background and knowledge of this region and energy sector. He's directed numerous programs with USAID, U.S. Trade and Development Agency, DOE, U.S. State Department, supporting market transformation, energy trade and investment and technology transfer in the region. He's currently working on 2 major USAID-funded regional transmission planning projects that have leveraged $700 million in transmission network investment. I could go on and on. I think his experience working in countries from Russia to Kosovo and across the region is so extensive. We're really looking to hear more from your perspective. So if we can, now that I've sort of greased the wheels a little bit and whetted everybody's appetite, perhaps we can start, Janis, first with you and with an opening statement, then we'll move down the row. And if I could, I'll give this to you too.
Thanks. Thanks for the invitation. Hello to everybody. It's always a pleasure to come to Washington, where I cannot say I started my career, but I spent some time in Washington very, very early on my professional path. And now I'm chairing this Energy Community Secretariat, as Jonathan said, for 5 years. Energy Community, just a few words about the organization, is an international organization based on a treaty and based on the rule of law. European Union initiated it or started or suggested to establish it back after Balkan Wars in beginning of 90s, 2000 and somewhere around there, and it is a copy of European Union, but only in energy issues or environmental issues related to energy issues as well. So European Union is usually not very successful in these global negotiations because it is very, it's not speaking with one voice usually, but it is very successful as an organization for regional cooperation. And it is always successful when exports such a model to its neighborhood. And the Energy Community is one of 2 such export products. The other one is European Economic Area. Energy Community functions approximately the same way as EU. So it has its own acquis, its own legal framework, directives, regulations, which are adopted by Ministerial Council, the same way as in EU, and also our directives are mostly copy-pasted from EU. It has a Ministerial Council, it has this permanent high-level group, which is an institution chairing this or managing this between 2 Ministerial Councils. It has even its own infringement procedure. Like in EU, we don't have a court, but still our infringement procedure is relatively efficient, and this is what makes organization, I would say, not only interesting but also effective, because countries have to respect what they oblige themselves being members. So we have a stick as well, and this is important, especially in this region about which we are talking today. And Energy Community has 8 contracting parties, Western Balkans, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia from this year on, and a few observers, Norway, Turkey, Armenia. And Belarus, surprisingly, asked for observership status last year as well. The first, then one of the first events after that was a visit of Russian ambassador to my office. What the hell is this now? I'm joking a little bit, but not far from truth. um, when we talk about, you asked to say something about priorities, third energy package implementation in this region, Black Sea region. In the past, we were only commenting reforms in all these contracting parties. And then Maidan happened in Ukraine. Then one of my colleagues said, let's go there, let's help them, let's protest, and so on. And then the other colleague said, look, we are an organization based on the rule of law. We cannot help them with protesting on Maidan. There are too many anyhow. Let's draft them the law, a gas market law. And then we did it. In the beginning, there was no echo. But then one day when IMF conditioned $17 billion with the approval of the gas market law compliant with third energy package, they called and they said, we would come to Vienna if we can finalize your draft gas market law. I said, okay, come. When would you come? Tomorrow. And they came. And so we finalized the gas market law back in 2015, January. Then it was, we pushed it through the government, we pushed it through the parliament, discussing every single amendment with all these lobbyists, and then it was adopted on 6th of April. So from mid-January to 6th of April, the whole legislative process, everything was adopted, and then by 1st of October that year, everything shall be implemented. Of course, it's too fast. And then we drafted all the secondary legislation, and everything entered into force on 1st of October. So it's possible if you really push, but of course implementation is another story, as you already indicated in your introduction. And from that time on, we drafted all the legislation in electricity, so electricity market related legislation, energy efficiency related, and so on for all our contracting parties. And everything is mostly transposed. So Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, sorry, Georgia not yet, but Moldova, Ukraine transposed third energy package fully, completely compliant, but implementation is another story. And Georgia is now in focus. They entered only on 1st of July this year, the organization, but the whole set of legislation is already prepared for them, and it just has to go into inter-service consultation into the parliament, and I hope all this will happen in the first half of next year. Talking about energy community acquis, so third energy package in gas, electricity, energy efficiency directives, and so on and so on. If I talk about other priorities in the region, Turkey was for some time following very closely what's happening, especially in the electricity sector. They completely transposed the third energy package. They're most progressive in comparison to other countries from the region. In gas, not at all. Gas is very state managed, or I mean government managed. But after this CAP, when it was last year, they even stopped coming on the meetings, so they're completely inactive, and now they're choosing another path. Armenia is also always very active, but on the end, not much is happening there because of different hurdles. Perhaps we will have time later to discuss about details. Belarus is also now very eager to reform at least electricity market sector because gas market is anyhow in 100% ownership of Gazprom, so they cannot do much. But this is also a request of when we are talking about EuroAsia. This is the title of the this roundtable or today's event. Eurasian Economic Union is a new fact, which and this Eurasian Economic Union, despite not being very efficient, has its own acquis. its own directives. They're not called directives like in European Union, they're called concepts, and they envisage opening of electricity market in 2019. What is important for Belarus, Armenia as well, but of course it will not happen as envisaged, because these countries are much less eager to reform their sectors as European Union member states. Um, if you said I should mention few key challenges for this region, I would say in Ukraine it is in gas sector unbundling. Unbundling of transmission system operator doesn't progress at all. And now you will perhaps laugh, but the biggest promoter of third energy package implementation in gas sector in Ukraine currently is Gazprom. Why? Because there is an arbitration procedure in Stockholm between Naftogaz, Ukrainian gas incumbent, and Gazprom. And Gazprom claims that Ukraine is not implementing third energy package. Ukraine says we do, and few things are happening because of that. But I'm afraid that after this arbitration will be over, which is end of November envisaged, so end of this month, things will perhaps get stuck again. When I'm talking about unbundling, the European Union, I have to say, becomes a little bit nervous because Ukraine is not really fully implementing third energy package, and nobody knows exactly what will happen with the transit of gas after 2019, when existing contract between Gazprom and Naftogaz expires. All these potential alternative routes will not be built yet, even if they will ever be, Nord Stream 2 and Turkish Stream. So it is of major importance that Ukraine really respects third energy package, which means third-party access and all other transparency rules. The second thing, but this is somehow above the radar of international community, and I believe there will be a happy end. But another thing which is below the radar is retail market. So wholesale gas market was reformed in Ukraine, it's functioning, no problems, many foreign companies now being active, but retail market is completely monopolized, and government even prohibited competition. And you have to know that 75% of this market is in ownership of Dmitro Firtash. It's a person who shall be expelled to United States, currently living in Austria. And government is really defending his interests, I can say. And we are struggling together with World Bank, IMF, European Union to reform this part of the sector as well, but currently not being very successful. If I talk about Moldova, if I talk about electricity in Ukraine, I have to say that electricity market, or Ukrainian electricity market, is an important one, but somehow also below the radar of international community, because Ukraine is even not synchronized with the Central European synchronous area. So there is no trade between Europe and Ukraine. There is an agreement between European Association of Transmission System Operators and Ukraine to synchronize them in 6 years. But I can tell you that Turkey signed such an agreement back in 2000 and implemented it fully in 2015. So they needed 15 years, and they were much better organized than Ukraine is. And so I don't believe that this will happen in 6 years. But this is an area where Ukraine would really need now a push and assistance, also with American experience. And so a lot of work for USAID. This can really be a game changer. Electricity market coupling with the rest of Europe. electricity market law was adopted. It shall be implemented by mid-2019. Now we are assisting them in this, but I didn't detect all the hurdles which will become obvious, I believe, just before the reform shall enter into force. Moldova is in gas, I mean, the only solution is interconnection with Romania. There is no, because Gazprom is complete monopolist in gas sector, and in electricity, they shall start electricity trade with Ukraine because they are in the same synchronous area. Georgia is also, I mean, has perhaps a bright future in electricity trade with Armenia and Turkey, but it depends on Armenia and Turkey as well, not only on Georgians. And the same goes for Azerbaijan. And all countries are very, very slow in the reforming of energy efficiency sector or imposing energy efficiency measures. This is, you cannot believe, I mean, the directives, energy efficiency directives, there are three. Energy labeling directive, energy efficiency directive, and energy performance of buildings directive. In Ukraine, everything was easier. So gas market reform, electricity market reform, at least transposition, implementation is another story. But it's impossible to transpose energy efficiency directives. There is so much of resistance in the country, you cannot believe. Perhaps, I mean, there's a lot of demagogy, perhaps because every housekeeper knows something about energy efficiency, and then really, they really find there a battlefield to fight against reforms. And a challenge is also not only in these countries, but also on the other side. It means in European Union. European Union integrated these countries as formally they are part of internal energy market, so nothing to say. But informally, the legal gap is increasing or getting deeper between EU and these countries. Because EU developed its internal rules till, I would say, last detail. Among them are around 20 so-called network codes in gas and electricity area. But EU didn't propose them to energy community contracting parties to transpose them. So these technical barriers on the border are becoming bigger and bigger. So, and you cannot have two types of countries in the same internal market. I mean, two legal systems. This doesn't function. So to overcome this, we as Secretariat proposed treaty amendments to the Energy Community Treaty to further integrate energy community contracting parties with EU member states. And this process moves, but in EU, also things are not going that fast as sometimes wished. To be, I mean, there will be hopefully some questions because I don't know in which direction to go. Things are happening, but the main, I mean, it's not easy with transposition somehow functions. Implementation is another story. The biggest problem is really resistance of interest groups. Read it, corruption. I would say especially in Ukraine and Moldova, much less in Georgia. One of the problems, I have to say, we have to admit, all of us here, is also non-coordinated approach of all Western partners, international financial institutions, European Union, Energy Community Secretariat, United States, I mean State Department, USAID, and so on and so on. We do not always speak with the same language. Sometimes we, you know, banks are banks, even if they're called donors. I don't know why banks are called donors. World Bank and EBRD and European Investment Bank and IMF. I mean, they're banks. They're interested in getting their money back. They're not, sometimes they don't care much about acquis or legal framework, legal compliance with the acquis. Other donors like USAID Kreditverwiederaufbau, it's German association, and so on, are sometimes interested just to spend the money which they have in their budget for technical assistance, and the product is sometimes not good. Then we have sometimes problems with that product, and the country says, look, but we got this from consultants from, I don't know, somebody, I will not name. It's their voice, you know. And then we say, but this is not functioning, I mean, it's not compliant, you know. You see, and they have a limited administrative capacity in the countries. So it's, I mean, we are flooding them sometimes with technical assistance, and they are confused. So this is also a sin on the Western side, I would say, when pushing for these reforms, and some better coordination. I don't know if it is possible, but would be urgently needed, because also in these countries, you know, they are very happy, and they are very skilled in, I can say, even cheating us, you know, working with one donor, another donor, third donor, bringing them against each other, establishing working groups, subgroups, sub-subgroups, immersing us into labyrinth of all these procedures. And of course, if we don't cooperate with each other well, then we are somehow lost. And a lot of taxpayers' money is lost as well. So all these are problems. Things are, I'm still optimistic. If I wouldn't be, I wouldn't be there where I am. But it goes much slower than expected some years ago. I was more optimistic some years ago than I'm nowadays, but I didn't become pessimistic yet. Thanks.
I can take this one here if you want to keep it.
It's going to be, Steve, thank you for that. Thank you. And I just, Steve, in turning to you too, I mean, some of the issues that were raised, including the last on cooperation, development cooperation. It should be noted that just, I think, 2 weeks ago, USAID Energy Community signed an agreement on greater cooperation, which I think is a positive step forward, but it's also just in general on development cooperation, international development cooperation. It's incredibly challenging, and it has been for the US and the EU, and I'm not just in the energy sector alone. I think this is a challenge across the board in support of EuroAtlantic integration, whether it's in the energy sector, economically, abroad. But you raised a couple of key topics too, from corruption to sort of vested interests in countries that are transitioning, that still remain, that hold back reform. Steve, just turning to you, just to also maybe just give an overview, but also to touch on some of the things that were already discussed and the work that you're currently doing.
Okay, well, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you to Director Kopacz as well. And I'm just going to, right at the start, pass the buck, because when you mentioned integrating Ukraine into the European central grid, USEA is one of our primary implementers in that regard, so I'm just passing that right on down to Will, so he can address that when we get to his point in the conversation. But I think, as most of you know, USAID is the primary development assistance agency for the U.S. government. I think we're more known for our disaster assistance, our humanitarian assistance work. In this region, it's the democratization work and so on. When you think of energy assistance, Africa usually generally is the first thing to come to mind. But the point I want to make is that we are still very active in the region. We have been active in the region since the 90s, the fall of communism, and we continue to. I think our role has changed. We started with basic assistance provision, basic getting utilities back up and running, moving them to market economies, that type of work, building the capacity of the institutions and so on. As we've moved on, we're seeing our role move more into advanced market structuring, that type of work. We do an awful lot of work with the utilities, an awful lot of work with the regulatory agencies and whatnot. I use a bad analogy quite often when I think of how we best coordinate or collaborate with the Secretariat. When you look at energy sector reform, Director Kopacz noted 15 years for Turkey just to integrate into the Central European network. I think 15 years was remarkable on how short of a period of time it took, right, given the distance at the start. So this is a 1 to sometimes more decade-long approach to reform an energy sector. And as the European legal framework just advances and becomes more complex, we have very limited absorptive capacity or implementation capacity in our countries. And where the Secretariat and others are very good is at that basic legal framework. So USAID will engage to some extent, but the analogy I use is whereas if you're building a house, right, they're going to do the framing or rough out your plumbing, and it's USAID that is really good at coming in and putting in the fixtures and making it a functional home. We're really good on the implementation side, and that's some credit to Will and his team at USEA, credit to the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. How do you actually run and govern a sector? That's the type of work that I think we in particular do a really good job at. So when you look at the Black Sea region, it has its own challenges. It's to some extent, I would say, a border region or a buffer region between Central Europe and some and more unstable areas surrounding. When you look to the Caucasus, you have the Middle East and instability there. You look on the eastern border with Ukraine, Moldova, you have heightened Russian aggression in that regard. So it's important for us to continue working in those countries to better integrate them into Europe, right? To improve that buffer, right? Because we're all, both North America and Europe are better with a stable Europe, right? Obviously. So the challenges that we see, I think Director Kopacz did a really good job summarizing those. What I would say in terms of donor coordination, it's for us, it's not getting enamored with the mega projects. Okay, it's not focusing, Jonathan mentioned pipeline politics. It's not just on energy transit corridors, bringing gas to Europe. Okay, you can build the pipeline, you can bring the energy supply, but if you don't have the transparent market structures in place, you're just furthering oligarch control. You're just furthering a system that to some extent needs further reform. So where we would do a better job is that on the ground, again, implementation, building it from the ground up. I wrote myself a couple notes because I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything here. You know, the point that I also would make is when you look back to work that we did at AID in the 90s and the early 2000s, a lot of our assistance recipients then are now our partners. You look to Eastern European countries, they're working with us now. I can look to utilities and regulatory agencies throughout the Baltic states, through even Slovakia, Poland, others that are working closely with us now to deliver assistance to the region, and that's really what USAID is designed to do, right? Is to bring these countries along. You know, the other point that I make is, you know, we still have a role to play. So at USAID, there's two things, right? So. Or two general rules that we keep, at least in the program I'm running. One is we're going to favor engagement, right, over say, a singular project, right? So it's, I guess the analogy would be keeping a seat at the table, right? So we have a strong history in the region. We want to continue working with the countries. We will continue to work with them to the extent that we can. And the other thing, and I'm going to steal a little bit from Will on this, because he articulated this once in a conversation a couple years ago, is we will do the technical and wait for the politics to catch up. Okay? So in that regard, I mean, I do think there is room for conditioning on assistance, but where USAID works with the sector stakeholders, we need to make sure that that system can be governed even if the country isn't ready to fully integrate. Right? So the continued work with the regulators, that continued work with the energy utilities, the stakeholders in the sector, as the political, the political structures in the country are trying to move forward, right? So in general, then, with those rules, we probably have three major areas we're focusing on energy-wise, right? It's the market development. Okay, so the problem that we see in the region is too many frozen conflicts, too much divide and conquer, right? So the more that we can bring countries into a larger, well-integrated market, we see security, energy security stemming from that, right? It's harder to isolate those in the well-integrated market. It is infrastructure development. Okay? So one of the issues, especially in the Eurasian countries, is, as Janusz mentioned, they're not synchronously interconnected with Europe. Right, so that to some extent makes the market integration a little bit more difficult. So we want to bring these countries, right, from a physical infrastructure perspective into Europe. Okay, and then as I'd already mentioned several times, right, it's the capacity building of the institutions. Okay, it's not just enough to have infrastructure projects. It's not just enough to have a legal structure. Right, it actually has to be implementable. Okay? And so once you get those three together, then you're actually moving the countries into Europe. And there's space for all donors at the table, and actually, well, the countries themselves. I'm gonna second Janusz's point about the need for better coordination. We can't do one without the other. We can't just be looking at the juiciest infrastructure project or the project with the best return without addressing the other issues, or we're gonna continue, I think, to circle on that. And with that, I think I'll stop in the interest of time and maybe pass it on to Will.
Yeah, I want to thank the German Marshall Fund for inviting me to this meeting. I don't often get to address such a distinguished group. We're working down in the weeds. You know, we're working at the technical level. We're an implementing partner, or as some would say, a contractor to the office that Steve runs at the U.S. Agency for International Development. So I'm going to give you a perspective of what it's like to be working with the actual utilities and the regulators in the field, some of the challenges they have. But just before I begin, let me give an overview of who we are. I work for the United States Energy Association. We're a nonprofit membership association. We're a voluntary membership association, and our membership spans the entire breadth of the U.S. energy industry. So we have members who are oil and gas companies and utilities. We also have federal agencies and state regulatory agencies here in the United States. We have equipment manufacturers. We started this work in the early 1990s, or actually in the late 1980s, when USAID changed its development assistance philosophy. Beginning in the sort of the late 1980s, USAID changed its philosophy from one where it was supporting parastatal institutions and building infrastructure for them to one in which it was seeking to seed private capital in infrastructure, particularly in energy, because it realized that building and just transferring assets to developing countries meant that several years later the assets fell into disrepair because they weren't operating as commercial utilities. So USAID changed its philosophy to one where it was seeking to establish electricity markets, oil and gas markets, et cetera, that would enable private enterprise to come in and fill the void that the governments were unable to fill, so that the governments then could take the capital that they were originally providing to the energy sector and put it into areas of the economy where private capital wouldn't enter, hospitals, schools, even roads. Our association got involved because we mistakenly thought that our members could provide some development assistance and also find business opportunities in the region. And at first they did find business opportunities, and they went all around the world looking for international investments as the U.S. energy industry became deregulated. But they soon found that the Europe and Eurasia region was a kettle of fish that was much more difficult to navigate than they had expected, and turned tail and never came back. But we felt as an association committed to the cause, I'll say, and we've remained committed for the last 25 years. And I want to start the discussion with a little story to tell you that one of the most important stories of the post-Cold War era that's never told is the story of how the U.S. and its European allies caused the physical disconnection of Central and Eastern European electricity networks from the Soviet networks and helped them to integrate into Western European electricity grids. And in order to do that, these countries, the first four, Poland, Hungary, Czech, and Slovak republics, had to overcome a number of similar technical, legal, political, and economic challenges, or conditions precedent, as they're called in the development assistance business, in order to join the Western European grid. They had to have a certain level of frequency. They had to have certain environmental requirements. They had to have commercial requirements that said that they could bill and collect revenue so that they would be stable and able to be good credit-worthy partners for electricity trade. And through a concerted effort, USAID, along with its European development partners, worked on all of these conditions precedent to the point where those 4 countries and later many others were able to synchronously connect. And synchronously connect is a technical term that just means physically cause the connection of 2 electric grids that were not operating on the same wavelength, to cause that to happen. And when that happened, it caused the physical then to physically disconnect from their Soviet, or at that point, Russian electric grid partners. That was a tremendous benefit to them for obvious reasons, for energy security purposes and for many, many other purposes that you can imagine. Now we're looking at 20 years later, we're replicating the process in Eurasia. But the challenges are far more difficult in Eurasia, far, far more difficult. We have 20 years of more of challenges to overcome. We have the legacies that are far more ingrained from the socialist and centralized planning that these countries were subjected to than the Central European partners were subjected to. We have a lack of human resource capacity related to markets, economics, civil society, journalism, and stakeholder interveners. So when we talk about the implementation of this tremendously difficult process, and we say that it's taking longer than it's to be expected, I think we're being hard on ourselves. We're putting these countries on a treadmill that's running much more quickly than we would put ourselves on. When we think about what we've done in the United States and Europe, and we've evolved over 120 years of electricity market reform, it's taken 120 years to get where we are. And we started with a democracy, and we started with civil society, and we started with markets and an understanding of markets. And now we're asking these countries to do it within the course of 15 years or 10 years. And we have to remember, in these countries, there are winners and there are losers from this process. And some will call it corruption, but those guys are going to be losers, and they're not going to give it up very easily. So there's got to be a change in generation. There's got to be a growth in capacity. There's got to be a growth in information technology capacity. Because when you're talking about electricity markets, you're talking about markets that are operating at the speed of light. Electricity moves at the speed of light. It's complicated. It doesn't have storage capability like a farm. You talk about markets in a traditional economic theory. When you go to college and you go to graduate school and you learn economics, they tell you about commodity markets. They tell you about corn, and they tell you that it can be stored, and that creates competition. You don't have that capacity in electricity. Everything is done in real time. Very, very complicated. You need sophisticated information technology. You need market structures that root out market abuses and market monopoly. That means you need to have people who can see that it's occurring at real time. You know, regulators that can be specialists and say, I see market power and market abuse. It's more than we would ever ask ourselves to do in the course of 15 years. And if we asked ourselves to do it, there would be chaos and civil disruption. So I'm proud of the work that we're doing. We're working down in the field, at the field level. So what we're doing is creating a capacity for these people to implement the laws that Janos is drafting. And it requires a consensus-building, slow, tedious process that sometimes is 2 steps forward and 1 step back. For example, one of the projects that Steve has I think with great wisdom, continued to fund after 16 years or 12 years of operation is a project that we operate called the Black Sea Transmission Planning Project. And I'm going to just give you an example of this because it's good for you to understand what I'm talking about when I say this is the nitty-gritty of development assistance. This project started in 2004 when we signed the Bucharest Memorandum of Understanding with 6 countries. It was Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, Turkey, well, it's actually more than 6, Bulgaria and Romania. These countries, even though they border the Black Sea region, they had no way of communicating with each other as to how their electricity grids would develop. They didn't have any way to plan their own electricity grids very effectively when the Soviet Union broke up. They had no software, and they had no training to do it. So Steve's U.S. Agency for International Development, I think with great wisdom, said, we're going to endow the region with a regional planning capacity so that all these countries that are connected to each other, even if they're not synchronously connected, can understand through the development of a mathematical simulation model of their electricity grids, how an investment in one of their grids would affect the other. So if you built a generation plant in Armenia, how would the electricity flow through a connected grid to Georgia, or in Ukraine, Moldova, or Romania, Moldova? And if there weren't connections between them, how could we build them most efficiently so that we can create the robust transmission network that would enable trade to occur? Because after all, what we're really seeking to do is connect these countries with each other, can connect them with Europe to foster electricity trade, to improve overall energy security, and create a sense of dependence within the region and with Europe, so that the region enters the EuroAtlantic Alliance. So after we provided them with transmission planning software. We trained them on how to organize their models. The models are just these databases that are mathematical simulations. And we said, let's pretend we're going to plan your network for, at that time, 2004. We were in 2004. So let's pretend we're going to do everybody's going to organize their own mathematical simulation model of 2010. So they put all the projects that were going to be in their network and on their electricity grid in 2010 in their model. We integrated the model together for all 7 countries, and we gave it back to them. Well, now we had a platform on which these countries could speak to each other and plan together. And the things that the European Union and the Energy Community Secretariat are asking them to do can now be modeled on this platform. So, for example, when Janos talks about the interconnection of Ukraine to Europe and the many, many technical requirements that Ukraine has to make, the many, many investments that Ukraine has to make, they now have a model on which they can look at it and say, if I make this investment, will I improve the frequency in Ukraine sufficiently enough that I can now, that the Europeans will accept me as a non-technical risk? Because if I join the European Union grid and I'm a technical risk, I could cause a blackout in Lisbon. Okay, that's how serious this is. And so we now have a model. But you know that model, it takes a long time to build it. It takes a long time to give people skills to be able to manipulate it. It takes a long time for them to understand the requirements that Janos is speaking about in terms of the European Union technical requirements. So it occurs, but it occurs slowly. And if you take that and you say, not only are we doing it from a technical basis, we have to make sure that the grid is robust, strong enough, and secure enough to connect with Europe. But we now also want you to do at the very same time, we want you to do the same thing with markets. We want you to organize markets at the same time as you're taking on this tremendous technical task. You must make your markets the same as our European markets so that we can trade across one platform without technical barriers, without legal barriers, without market barriers. You're asking them to do an awful lot with a very limited capacity. So every day we're in the field working with these guys, and they're learning, and they're applying what we're teaching them. And we're seeing things that we never thought possible occur. And I think one of the really great things that Steve's office does is it allows us the freedom to imagine things that currently don't seem possible. So we're proposing now, we're working on our next year's work plan to do a system adequacy study for the entire region. And this means looking ahead 15 years and saying, in 15 years, will your transmission network be sufficiently robust to incorporate high levels of renewable energy? Will it be sufficient enough to support electricity trade among yourselves and Europe? And if not, what do we need to do to help you get there? And right now, if you ask them that, it would be, their eyes would glaze over and they would say, we'll never get there. We can't. It's impossible. But with this model and with this technical assistance, they can begin to see it slowly. And so things that we said five years ago to do, for example, building a connection between Armenia and Georgia, which is now being discussed in a real way with financing from the Germans. And even though it's slowed down a little bit, it looks like it's going to happen. We proposed to do that 5 years ago, and now, through our studies, proved it technically capable and that economically it made sense, and now it's happening. So we're seeing great progress. We're seeing tremendous benefit to the region. If we let up now, we're going to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. We're almost there. We're almost there, and through better coordination, through a more focused effort, and staying with it, we're going to help these people in the Eurasia region end the potential next century of tyranny and join the EuroAtlantic Alliance. It's just going to take a lot more effort to get there.
Well, thank you. I think you highlighted some of the key challenges, but also the importance of how long this process takes with your experience and the importance of sticking to it. And I think in terms of the energy sector and discussions here in Washington, assistance levels highlights the point that I think that a lot of people are making, which is keep these resources flowing. They have, these projects and efforts take a long time. One of the concerns I always had at USA too is that you'd have this, quick cutoff of funding, and then you would have ongoing projects that are progressing. You'd have funding drop out, and you wouldn't have the resources. So, Giannis, you pointed out the point about wasting or the potential to do that or lack of coordination, and I think this is just it's critical that it happen. But I also wanted to make sure that we're connecting why it's so important for those people. We have I think a very diverse group that comes from across different parts of this of the energy sector and industry, and trying to make a connection on how all of this fits in with those who are looking at pipelines itself. That you need to have one to do the other, and they all fit together to make up this important landscape. So with that said, we're going to open up the floor to question and answer. Please identify yourself, who you're with, and please try to keep your comments short and to the point, and to a question as well. And as moderator, I just wanted to maybe open up to address some of these challenges and trends, and ask. Obviously, in Washington, there's a great deal of focus today on Russia, and that's for a number of different directions, from disinformation. But one of the areas that we found and others find most disconcerting is the direct attacks on energy infrastructure in the region, particularly in Ukraine. And I'm wondering, both from the energy community, but also from USAID, from your end too, how you see what could be done to prevent such cyber attacks. What are you doing now from the government side? Steve, I know USAID, and you've been long engaged in this issue. And what should we be doing with partners, particularly partners that are still going through the types of transition that make them particularly vulnerable to these types of attacks, let alone our own vulnerability in the United States and across Europe? So I know it's a wide topic, but it's one that has gained greater attention here. And because you're working really both at a higher level, but also right at the grassroots level, how should we be addressing this challenge, and what are you doing from your perspective positions to address these issues?
Okay. Here, it would be fair that Steve starts, because United States are here much more advanced than European Union, I would say. And USAID is active in the region in at least trying to persuade energy regulators to dedicate a piece of tariff in regulated activities for this, for the cybersecurity expenses. What is here? We are. This cybersecurity became an issue not that long ago. It's now, let's say, fashionable for last 1, 2, 3 years only. In the United States, perhaps you had it on the agenda much earlier. I don't know, but European Union is currently in a very complicated process of amending the whole set, so more than 100 directives and regulations in the energy sector, and the whole package is called so-called clean energy package. It goes into this, let's say, climate. I mean, it's being adapted. The third energy package plus many other directives are being currently adapted to follow so-called 2030 targets related to climate issues and renewables and so on and so on. So it's a very complicated process inside European Union, and cybersecurity was somehow not in the early beginning part of this big process. So now the whole European Union is busy with, I mean, energy world in European Union is busy with dealing with clean energy package. Cybersecurity is not such an issue in Western Europe. It's a bigger issue in Central and in Eastern Europe. This is why it was a little bit not forgotten. Now it is discussed, but it was not remembered early enough. Now we feel let's say a gap or a need to have some rules related to cybersecurity, particularly in this region. So if we go from north to south, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia, this part, and east, so it means towards Ukraine, Moldova, and so on. So there is one possibility, Secretariat is now discussing it, to adopt special rules only for this region. So a new type of acquis related to cybersecurity. This is possible under Energy Community Treaty because EU is also member of the Energy Community, and the treaty allows something like this, such an, let's say, separated approach. But we all need to develop proper expertise inside institutions, so European institutions, and inside countries. That's it. So there is a legal gap because these things have to be also regulated. It's not enough only to have knowledge. It's not enough only to have money to deal with IT. Things also need to be regulated. So this is still in front of us. I didn't give a clear answer when and how it will happen, but we are working on it. But still is more on a battlefield.
Before I start, what I would say is that our colleagues at Department of Energy, Department of Defense, Department of Justice are far more attuned to cyber issues than we are at USAID, and we're trying to draw heavily on their experience and to work with them closely. What we are looking at in terms of cyber in the region is it's just, you know, another form of aggression, and I can't call it just a distractor because it's gone beyond that. You know, as Will mentioned, it's incredibly complex to balance the power system, and we're throwing markets at them with lightning speed flow of information. And so these vulnerabilities exist throughout everything that we're doing. At USAID, at least, our thought is in looking at the region and looking at utilities that are struggling just to maintain day-to-day operations, you know, let alone consider more advanced threats, is to get this into the corporate consciousness and to find basic practices, the things that can improve. I don't want to get into specifics, but if you go into the substation attacks in Ukraine, those were all very preventable from just very basic best practices that could be applied. One of the requirements for these countries moving into the European Union, or addressing the Energy Community Treaty requirements, is network development plans. So an important part for us is as you are upgrading your networks, as you're moving to more automated control, don't do it twice. Right? The first time, think about the cyber standards that you want to be putting into your systems. Right? Think about the needs that you're going to have. Think about how to approach your regulatory agencies. Right? You're going to have to recoup these investments. Right? And we have a region where power prices are kept low, right, as a matter of political favor. Right? So it's a hard sell sometimes to come and ask for costs to be recouped in an issue that isn't necessarily in the consciousness. So it's again, this continued development, this continued bottom-up approach to try to make sure that, just yet one other threat is being dealt with while we have everything else in terms of moving into the EU and so on. I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add there, Will.
I think both of our panelists have kind of said a lot of what I wanted to say. I think the most important thing is that in this region, situational awareness, believe it or not, is still a challenge. Because if you haven't been attacked, it's not a high priority for you. You think it's going to happen to someone else. And if you want to get your utility to be to improve its cyber security posture, you've got to engage your senior management. If you haven't been attacked, your senior management probably is fighting a lot of alligators off in the swamp. As Steve said, it's fighting issues related to market reform. It's trying to meet these technical requirements. It's dealing with corruption. It's dealing with subsidies. It's dealing with deferred maintenance. And cybersecurity, if you haven't been attacked, doesn't rank as one of the top priorities. But it's going to come to you. It's going to come to you. It's just a matter of time. So what we're working on is Steve and I have launched a new cybersecurity working group in Eurasia, where we're trying to get to the seniors to tell the senior management, this is what's coming your way. You need to get a strategy in place, and we're giving them tools to assess their cybersecurity posture. Steve mentioned the Department of Energy and its laboratories have had a worldwide leadership in this area, and we're trying to transfer tools that enable utilities to take a first cut and assess their cybersecurity posture. Once they've been able to do that, they'll be able to write a roadmap for how to improve it. They can select certain domains. We call them domains. These are management areas related to cybersecurity. And they can prioritize them based on where they see their vulnerabilities. When they do that, we'll help them write a network development plan that Steve mentioned, which is a plan that says, by a certain time, I'm going to have this equipment on my network. I'm going to install these policies and procedures. I'm going to take it to the regulator. I'm going to show them that with these investments, we're going to be more secure, and ask the regulator to secure the investments in the tariff. So it's a long-term process, but I think the first step is just achieving situational awareness among the utility management.
Thank you. And I think it was always a worst case nightmare thinking about the impact on cyber attacks in Ukraine as the United States, Europe, and others were trying to support the transition post-Maidan, that you would have the impact economically, let alone the impact on reforms in the sector. So struggling economies, struggling transitioning countries are vulnerable to hybrid warfare. We know that, but it's important that we be thinking about how do we bolster and strengthen their capacity at the very local level, at the ground level, to address these challenges, because often it will be somebody at a substation, maybe perhaps, depending on the modeling, who's going to be addressing challenges. Why don't we do this? Let's open up the conversation to everyone who's participating here today. Please raise your hand, and somebody will be around with a microphone.
Hi, good morning. I'm Brenda Schaefer from Georgetown University. 2 questions to Mr. Burns. One, could you tell us the current level of U.S. assistance to the Black Sea countries for energy market reform, and how does that compare with previous years, if you have the data? And second, before U.S. aid embarked on massively or significantly supporting energy market reforms on the basis of the third energy package to the Black Sea countries, did it take any comprehensive study about what the meaning of transplanting third energy package, which is primarily within EU member countries with strong rule of law, strong institutions, where even by EU Commission reports to the Commission itself, its own internal reports after almost a decade of liberalization, prices of Europe of gas, electricity have not gone down, market is more centralized, fuel mix is more import dependent and higher dependent on Russia. Most markets have not succeeded in diversifying despite all the efforts. Taking this package, transplanting it to countries where most of them don't control their borders, have Russian forces deployed in these countries, weak rule of law, and very little precedence of local versus national government on energy law.
Okay, let me address. That was a lot. So let me address the let me address the first part first, and Janusz wanted to address the second. So I'll pass to him, and then when I'm transitioning in my mind, then I can think to my response there. So on the first part with respect to budget, without getting into specific numbers, what I can say is for the past maybe decade or so, our budget in the region has been relatively stable. So in spite of rhetoric to the contrary. U.S. aid, I think in terms of energy support overall, has refocused a lot to Africa. But we are no longer in the transition that we were in the 90s. We're no longer immediately post-war in the Balkans, so obviously the budget levels have come down, but they stabilized at a level that we've been keeping forward. And Congress earlier this year also put forward a supplemental for countering Russian influence that has benefited the program. So I would answer that question with that. With regard to the second, do you want to start, and then I'll jump in?
Third energy package, you mentioned some critics inside EU about effectiveness of it, but I will try to illustrate this with 2-3 cases. So third energy package is all about competition. And European Union has, energy policy has fashionable trends as well. You know, some years competition is fashionable, some years sustainability is fashionable, some years security of supply is fashionable. And all these waves in energy policy design are somehow interfering with each other. So third energy package is a result of some years of a wave of fashion of competition. And I think it is very successful, but of course it conflicts with some other legal solutions which come out of the area of the years of fashion of sustainability or out of the years of fashion of security of supply. But in general, it functions very well. When we talk about electricity, the prices came down very much. Not for final consumers, but for, I mean, the prices of generation went down enormously in the last years in European Union. And the same trend is slowly coming into energy community contracting parties as well. Final price for consumers didn't went down because European Union is massively supporting renewable energy sources, and this of course has to be paid by electricity consumers. But this will, on a longer run, this decrease of prices will happen as well. When we talk about gas, gas became, competition in gas markets increased incredibly in last, even not 10 years, last 5 years in European Union. And this was all because of new small interconnections, not big pipelines. You know, politicians are still crazy about talking about big pipelines, big projects, to have big ribbons to cut. But what helps are these small, not very sexy interconnections, which really increase the market, the competition on the market. And this happened massively in European Union because of legal, because of acquis, which now imposes this, and because of some political decisions. Let's illustrate with few of them. Lithuania built LNG terminal, and before that Gazprom had a complete monopoly, and the price went down for 22% over the night of gas, just because of this, when this LNG terminal was finalized. And why? Russians are behaving competitive if there is a competition, but if there is no competition, they squeeze the customer as much as they can. Then, for example, next case is prices of Russian gas are, if you look on the statistics, they're highest in Eastern Europe, and then slowly they go down towards Western Europe. Sometimes I joke and I say if they would export gas to towards New York, it would be for free, because where there is more competition, they adapt. So the countries which pay the highest price for Russian gas are countries where Gazprom has complete monopoly. And so on and so on. And another case, now about third energy package. When I was director of directorate, my staff was, Slovenia was always the case with the highest retail prices of gas in European Union. And I said, but it's impossible. And I was asking my colleagues in the ministry, how do they said, no, it's a statistical mistake. European Union is reporting this wrongly, And then because we had 16 traders on the market, and then later it came out. Then when the 17th one came, and he was a real competitor, the prices dropped for 1/3, 33-35% in a month. Why? Because this 16, it came out later, were discussing the prices among themselves on a secret place in a restaurant from time to time, and they were sharing the market, So competition really helps. And third energy package is about competition, and of course there are problems in some markets in European Union, but in general it functions very well, and I think that European Union is very happy to have this third energy package, and we as Secretariat are very happy to export it to our contracting parties. But of course there are, as you can see from this case, from my personal experience, law transposition is not enough. Full implementation is important.
So I think what I would add to that is, the world isn't static. And so I think part of what I was trying to understand in your question is, so we've been at this for a while, and we still haven't achieved the supply diversity that we're hoping to get, and given the difficulty of implementation, kind of some discussion on that. And the third energy package is incredibly complex, and you're working on a fourth now, correct? At the EU. It is a heavy lift for the countries we're in. But what I would say is, if we look to Russia, it is not static. So there continues to be efforts to use energy as a manipulator. There is energy supply concerns that are a big player in terms of politics, Armenia, Moldova, other places. So looking at the third energy package, even though it's complex, it is, diversity of supply isn't necessarily just fuel source, right? It's supplier, right? So we are starting to see more LNG terminals, right, as a potential counterweight to gas supply in the region. Okay? Be you in favor or not, just the renewable energy requirements in Europe, right? There's an alternative electric supply there. So that's part of what's embedded in the requirements, and it is a heavy lift, but it's a pathway that we have forward to try to diversify, if not just the specific technology, but the supplier themselves.
Bundle a few questions, and that way we'll get everybody in, because I want to make sure that we keep the trains running on time. So I know there's a question in the back, and if anybody else has any questions, please raise your hand.
Yes, hello. My name is Salim Ali. I'm a professor at the University of Delaware. And my question is about the Black Sea as an ecological region, apart from, of course, the political aspects. The sea as an entity could potentially be an avenue for more diplomacy based on science and environmental issues as well. And I'm wondering if, given the current dynamics with Russia, has there been still some effort to engage at that level, either through USAID's science-based channels, or on the technical side with the energy industry as well, so that there is perhaps a door opening in that capacity?
Another hand in the back, too, raised.
Hi there. I'm with OPIC, Overseas Private Investment Corporation with the U.S. government. And we are, one of our key priorities is energy security for Eastern Europe, and the way we work is with private sector companies to catalyze the capital in these markets. I know you guys mentioned a lot of efforts from these governments to privatize and allow private sector ownership. For OPIC to really engage, we need 51% ownership from the private sector, and I know countries like Ukraine, for instance, are doing some of their auctions of the natural gas fields. We hear that like Poland, for instance, is not really amenable to sort of private sector ownership. So I guess, we're curious as to where we can leverage our tools in Eastern Europe to promote, this common goal, and if there are specific projects that we can engage in Eastern Europe, whether it's small interconnectors, we'd love to dig in and be a part of that solution.
Why don't I can start. So to the first question with regard to science in the Black Sea region, I would say that prior to the Maidan, we actually were engaging with Russia. USAID was engaging with Russia on certain science-based activities, at least through the agency. As you know, maybe 5 years ago now, the relationship ended, the official relationship. I'm looking at Jonathan. I think I can't remember the date, but at least from AID's perspective, there is not necessarily or regrettably, we don't have as much engagement as perhaps we would like. I'll look to others to add to that. To our colleague from OPIC, first of all, let's talk after out in the hall, because I think we've got some projects we could bring you in on. But to a point, third-party access in the power sector, at least, or maybe even the gas sector, is a big issue in the region. Right? You've got embedded interests that are working to prevent third-party supply. A lot of that is the genesis of the third package and so on, right? Trying to unbundle some of these embedded entities to allow alternative ownership structures and prevent bias towards the quasi-monopolistic national generators and such. So this is an issue we continue to try to untangle. We're seeing projects develop. We're seeing projects where there are interested investors. Will had mentioned that Western investors ran and have never come back. We're starting to get the hints of interest again, at least from here in the United States, and we'd like to encourage that. But we want to get it to a more sustainable footing as opposed to just individual one-offs on a country-by-country basis. I don't know if you all have anything you want to add.
I think what Steve says is correct, and we're starting to see the success of the reforms where third-party access, through the creation of independent transmission system companies, and now from the unbundling at the distribution level, where supply and the wires function are being unbundled, is opening space for independent power producers, whether they be smaller companies who are looking at low voltage projects on the distribution side, or large renewable energy developers who are looking at it on the transmission level, and those are the green shoots that we're seeing, and I think Steve is right. We're beginning to see the more risk-tolerant Western companies come back to the region because of the reforms that have been successfully implemented in so many of these countries.
Perhaps something about investments. In electricity power sector, okay, Moldova doesn't have practically any power plants, but Ukraine has too many. So there is not much space for new investments. I mean, of course, many of them have to be restructured because of environmental issues, especially coal power plants. But I believe the owner, anyhow, again, around 75% of all coal power plants is in ownership of one person, Mr. Akhmetov. He will have to deal with this by himself, I believe. Of course, perhaps he will need some foreign partners. But if we talk about renewables, which are now, let's say, the most lively area of investments, Ukraine is currently a golden mine, you know, but this will not last. I mean, this is not very healthy. Uh, their um, their subsidy, feed-in tariff for solar panel electricity from solar panels is 150 euros per megawatt hour. So let's say $170, something like this. I mean, it's crazy. Currently, in Germany, which has much less sun, this is 60 euros per megawatt hour. You know, the country will bankrupt if they will have more investments, and of course there is plenty of interest for investments. But then what happens? The state somehow, through non-very transparent approaches, tries to cool down the interest for investments because they will bankrupt otherwise. So this needs to be adapted in an economically sustainable way, not environmentally sustainable, because renewables are environmentally sustainable. And the problem in Ukraine is that all this is envisaged in the law, and they cannot change the law. You know, all other countries around the world are adapting this in secondary legislation, which government then adapts from time to time. But in Ukraine, everything has to be in a law, and this as well, and it's a big problem. So, I mean, it's not an answer, but the third thing which I wanted to say, all these countries are desperately needing investments into infrastructure, which can be profitable on the long run, very much. I'm very sorry that nobody from West bought Moldovan transmission system operator, and now Gazprom is majority owner. Ukraine didn't want to sell anything, but they desperately need investments. So I would say don't look that much into production or generation. Infrastructure, I think, is more compelling and better on the long run. Just look at Chinese. I mean, they're trying to buy infrastructure all around Europe now because it's a long-lasting rent bringing investment which will never end. Generation comes and goes, but infrastructure remains.
Can I just add one point to that? It kind of circled us back around to the beginning, right? It's interesting to talk about $1 billion, $2 billion power plants. It's interesting to talk about mega pipelines and so on, right? The Eurasian countries tend to be energy rich. They're just more politically hampered than actual resource hampered. But it is the infrastructure, it's the underlying infrastructure that is the investment need. It's the refurbishing of the existing power plants. It's the smaller gas interconnectors. It's the electric power grid. Right? Those are areas where there's significant investment need, and there's actually profit to be had. Right? But it's not as fun to focus on as some of these big mega deals that you always hear about in the press.
Great. Let's take 2 more questions. Any additional questions? Yes, we'll take here and here. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is a question to Mr. Kopacz. This third energy package that is certain requirements that is applied to Russian Gazprom in Eastern and Western Europe, are those requirements going to apply to partner countries for energy contracting parties of energy community? And in general, are you considering more sort of conditional? We've heard about how Ukraine was asked to join, actually, or demanded to join energy community. Are there any considerations of Russia to be not joined, but maybe played more rule-based game on gas and other industries as well? Thank you.
Why don't we bundle these together?
Hi, I'm Vlad Muzyrev, Embassy of Ukraine. Actually, it's not more like a question, but like a comment. Because yes, we would like to see more faster progress in energy reforms in Ukraine, but frankly speaking, it's extremely fast. We are just less than 3 years in these reforms, and we've already achieved more than most of the countries during the same period of time. So we are in the IMF program, and actually energy reform is one of the key reforms from the IMF. So, and we have succeeded. So I guess it's quite difficult to say that we are like too slow in that. Sure, it's an extremely complicated question, and you're correct that it's impossible to make in 2 years. So sometimes it's take 15 years, like in Turkey. But we are in reforms, in energy reforms, and that's extremely important for us. Thanks.
If I can comment first, Ukraine, I mean, really, the Ukrainian nation as a whole is really paying a big price of all these reforms. And I mean, I really feel all positive emotions with these reform processes. But we have to be honest. In Ukraine are good guys and bad guys, like in every other country. There are reform forces in Ukraine. I won't name them now, but recently we prepared a list of good guys and bad guys in the electricity market, but we didn't distribute it. But there are very strong opponents, also Ukrainians. Of course, somebody said these are people who will perhaps not be winners of these reforms, and they are strongly opposing. Processes are going on, and at least I have to say, I mean, compared to other contracting parties, today we are talking about Black Sea region, but we have also Western Balkan, 6 countries. If I talk, there is Serbia, which is usually praised as the most progressive and so on, but if I compare reforms in gas sector in Serbia or in Ukraine, it's completely black and white story. I mean, in Serbia, everything is stuck. Ukraine is, you know, moving 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. At least many things are happening. That's good. But about Russian gas and influence, perhaps I didn't understand the whole scope of a question, but European Union has a little bit of a problem. It's together with energy community countries, contracting parties, because third package is now relevant on this territory, but not on the territory outside EU or on the board. It's not completely clear what is happening on the border of EU. And this is the problem of Nord Stream 2, where now Commission decided that despite there is a legal vacuum, they will anyhow still insist on getting a mandate of European Council to negotiate Nord Stream 2, because they feel that there is that the gap has to be filled somehow with something. So this third energy package is not completely 100% waterproof or gas-proof, I would say, and it needs some additional efforts. But otherwise, perhaps I didn't understand, but this is...
third energy package would apply to contracting parties as well.
Yeah. The third energy package is in transposed.
Would you be as adamant to implement it with Eurasia as it is in the member states?
Yes, that's the whole purpose of energy community. As a, let's say, if I don't say it very humble, it's a European energy diplomacy on a battlefield.
Steve, Will, do you want to respond?
I would just, 2 points. I think you had mentioned, well, do we foresee Russia as a trading partner or a value trading partner as the third energy package develops? And I was absolutely yes. I mean, we've talked a bit about Russian influence or Russian aggression during the conversation today, but everything that we're doing is law-based, is rules-based, right? Because we would like to see a time 5, 10 years downstream where it's not the battlefield per se, right? But it is more energy diplomacy, and so it's just having the structures in place. And then just in a response to the gentleman from Ukraine, I would say, we applaud your efforts. There's a lot changing. There's a lot of institutional momentum against change, and so it is going to be challenging. And I would say we're here to stand by you to work through it. Right, that's part of our function. I think both of our institutions. I would leave it at that. I don't know, Will, if you.
So why don't we do this? We are a little bit over time, and what I'd love to have happen right now is maybe just closing thoughts, and we can start with Will and come all the way down on this end. I just want to say to our Ukrainian embassy friend that it's not lost on anybody that not only is the energy sector reform taking place, but reform across a number of sectors with a hot war in the East, economic disaster averted shortly after the new president came to power. So I think we understand there's context here, but I think the point being is the continued push forward in this sector is going to be critical to Ukraine economically, politically, its democracy and anti-corruption fight. And so this work needs to continue, but we understand that it will take time for it to take place. So why don't we start, Will, on your end with closing points?
Well, I'll just return to the theme that I introduced earlier, which is that we're seeing a lot of green shoots. And in terms of indicators, I think we're beginning to see investment coming back. I think of the hydropower plants that we're seeing in Georgia that are being constructed there for trade with Turkey, growing and burgeoning electricity market in Turkey. And we are seeing that because the interconnector, it was put in place between Georgia and Turkey. And Georgia began a process of opening up its electricity market to enable a wholesale trade and trade with Turkey. If Armenia builds the interconnector with Georgia that's being discussed, we'll begin to see sort of grassroots investor interest there as well. And we'll see electricity traders and suppliers begin to take advantage of arbitrage situations between the country's prices of power during different times of the year, when Georgia has hydro and when it doesn't, when Armenia has its nuclear and when it's taking its nuclear power plant down for refurbishment. So, as Steve and Janusz said, maybe these interconnector projects aren't the most sexy or glamorous projects, but they're providing the space and the infrastructure and the superhighway for this integration and trade, and not only trade within the region, but as Turkey reduces the congestion within its own grid and becomes the linchpin between the Black Sea and the Balkans, we'll see more intra-regional trade. And I think now is the time to continue to pursue these reforms, even though they're painful and difficult for the countries that are having to implement them. We're seeing the success, and we need to keep at it.
I would just build on what Will said. We focused a little bit on some of the negatives today, but looking to the positives, in the Caucasus, Georgia's been a leader, at least from an energy sector, in terms of looking westward, integrating into Turkey and whatnot, and it's a pool. Its neighbors are looking to that as well and wanting to benefit. Both Armenia and Azerbaijan are looking to Georgia as potential a transit corridor or a place to export power to. So we see that we see the fruits of the local labor there in terms of improving the energy sector. You look to Ukraine. It hasn't been smooth, but who would expect it to be smooth with a war in the east? So again, kind of that westward orientation, looking to Europe, looking to more stable market structures. So while there is work to be done, and I use a word Will uses sometimes to describe me as a Pollyanna, right? No, that's not the case. There's a lot of work to be done, but let's just take stock of the progress that has been made, and know that we need to keep working at it. And we'll keep working at it at AID, and the Secretariat is a critical partner in this. And I'll stop there.
I somehow I somehow summarized my my appearance here in the beginning when I said that I am less optimistic than I used to be, but I'm still optimistic. But for the end, I would like to say only that energy is for Eastern Partnership, or let's say all Eastern countries. I'm talking about Western Balkans as well. It's the major political battle. So in Ukraine, for example, only knowing the energy policy and energy developments in last 15 years can explain not only the modern history of Ukraine, because all oligarchs are in energy sector, this or that way, and of course they are creating the life of Ukraine. But it's also about the modern history of Europe of last 15 years or 20 years. So I hope once I will have time, perhaps with somebody else, perhaps somebody is there interested in the audience, to write a really extensive or intensive book about the modern history of Europe, which will be all related directly or indirectly to energy policy issues in Eastern Partnership countries, especially in Ukraine. It's really an exciting era in which we are living, and I hope it will have a happy end.
Well, thank you so much. If you could all join me in thanking the panelists. We're going to have our next panel coming up, so please stick around, and thank you again for coming early this morning on a Monday.